Lecture 24, Class Conflict in Industrial America. Before we examine cultural products associated with the Grand Canyon, we need to understand the context within which the Grand Canyon was constructed as a desirable destination. We need to know why certain groups of people traveled across the country to participate in this Western fantasy. At the heart of class studies are complex discussions about relationships between work and leisure and the unequal and uneven social relations of labor under capitalism in U.S. society. The socioeconomic landscape, including definitions of work and leisure, were undergoing radical shifts in the United States at the turn of the century. Industrialization, meaning the shift in a society from primarily agrarian to manufacturing, began to dramatically impact the shape of American society as early as the early 19th century. And by 1900, the US was the world's predominant industrial nation, the workshop of the world. 54% of the employed population worked in industrial manufacturing and lived in crowded urban centers. But the economy wasn't stable. As industrialism quickly enveloped the East, corporate tycoons managed to reorganize business in order to protect themselves and their investors from serious financial loss. They established the modern corporation, which employed a tiered investment and management strategy that acted as a buffer to absorb economic tremors. The workers, however, were at the bottom of this tiered system and acutely felt the impact of any economic instability. Workers suffered through the 7-year depression of the 1870s and the massive collapse of the economy in 1893, which caused the unemployment of more than 20% of the workforce. This shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy was marked by the establishment of mines, factories, and railroads, and increasing numbers of merchants and shopkeepers who comprised the new and growing American middle class. But industrialization also created a working class or a class of working poor, comprised of unskilled laborers. Because of technological advances like the assembly line, which enabled the mass production of consumer goods, factory workers no longer needed or learned specialized skills. They became cogs in the industrial machine. And because, at that time, the United States didn't regulate corporations or have any safety or labor standards that protected workers, many working class laborers were subjected to horrific working conditions that compromised their health and safety, and it was compounded by criminally low wages and the constant threat of unemployment. The majority of these unskilled laborers were immigrants who had come to the United States seeking opportunity to pursue the American dream. You can imagine how devastating the reality of a 16-hour workday in a dangerous factory in the center of a filthy, crime-plagued city would have been for these immigrants. Needless to say, there was growing unrest in the working classes at the turn of the century. Workers responded to the social inequity and the dangerous conditions of their workplaces by organizing unions and striking. Strikes, even those involving women and children, were usually violent and sometimes brutal, resulting in deaths of workers. Class warfare erupted in the factories, plants, and yards of the major cities in the early 20th century. Fueled fueling the fire was the growing disparity between the haves and the have-nots. In 1890, of the 12.5 million families in the United States, 11 million received an annual income of $380. To give you some perspective, the poverty line was $500 a year, meaning 88% of American families were living below the poverty line. In contrast, in 1877, several years earlier, oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller was earning $720 per hour. By 1900, 1% of the population owned more of the nation's wealth than the remaining 99% combined, something that is actually echoed today in our current economy. 5% of the population owned 50% of the land and housing. 30% owned the other 50%, which left 65% of the population owning only the clothes on their backs and their furniture, and most of them living hand to mouth. The middle and elite classes had developed acute concerns and fears about class warfare and the growing population of immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe and China. 3 million immigrants entered the U.S. between 1900 and 1905 alone, and most of them migrated directly to large urban centers. Cultural nationalists feared what they termed the dilution of the American race, or race suicide. These fears resulted in anti-immigration campaigns and rampant racism, including the increasing popularity of social Darwinism and eugenics. If you're interested in learning more about this stuff, check out my Humanities FKL course, AMS 2270, 20th Century American Culture. So, this drastic shift to industrialism created political, economic, and social instability. As the conditions of labor attendant to industrialism caused unrest and violence in cities, the increasing number of upper middle class Americans, as well as the wealthiest classes, sought relief from these conflicts, anxieties, and pollution that seemed to be the new normal in industrial America. Tourism, a flourishing industry by the late 19th century, offered leisure opportunities for those with means and promised escape into and rejuvenation through nature and physical exertion. By 1900, the American social elite, as well as the growing upper middle class, had been exposed to a multitude of cultural products that extolled the sublimity and beauty of wild nature, as well as the adventure and drama of the Wild West. In addition, railroads were producing and distributing promotional materials encouraging Americans with means to journey west and experience the natural wonders and Wild West adventures in style and luxury. Locations like the Grand Canyon became primary destinations for Americans who wanted a reprieve from the anxieties of the industrial East and a chance to live the Western drama.